In 1858, an engineer named George Pullman put 5,000 men with jack screws under every building on a single block in downtown Chicago and raised the entire block 6 feet into the air. Hotels, shops, offices, some of them 4 stories tall and full of guests, lifted inch by inch over the course of days while people walked in and out of the front doors like nothing was happening. They raised the entire city, not one building, the whole city. And the reason they had to do it is almost impossible to believe today. Chicago was drowning in its own filth, and the only way to save it was to pick it up and start over. To understand why anyone would attempt something this insane, you have to understand what Chicago was in the 1830s and 1840s. Because on paper, this city should never have existed at all. When the first settlers arrived at the southwestern shore of Lake Michigan, they found a swamp. Not a marsh, not wetlands, a genuine, ankle-deep, mosquito-infested swamp that flooded every time it rained and never fully drained. The land sat roughly 4 feet above the level of Lake Michigan, in some places less than that. The water table was so high that if you dug a hole 2 feet deep, it would fill with water before you could finish digging. The soil was black muck, saturated clay and sand. Nothing solid, nothing stable. Nothing that any reasonable person would look at and say, yes, this is where we should build a major city. The Potawatomi people who lived there called it Chekagoo. Historians still argue about what that name meant. Some say it referred to wild onions that grew in the marshes. Others say it meant striped skunk. Either way, it was not a compliment. It was a description of a place that smelled bad and was difficult to live in. The native peoples used the area for hunting and trading, but they did not build permanent settlements there. They knew better. And yet white settlers kept coming. By 1833, Chicago was incorporated as a town, with a population of roughly 350 people. By 1840, it had grown to over 4,000. By 1850, nearly 30,000 people lived there. And by 1854, it was the fastest growing city in America, with almost 75,000 residents. The population was doubling every few years. New arrivals poured in by the thousands. The reason was location. Chicago sat at the intersection of the Great Lakes shipping routes and the emerging railroad network. It was becoming the gateway between the East Coast and the expanding western frontier. Grain from the prairies of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Iowa flowed through Chicago on its way to eastern markets. Manufactured goods from the factories of New York and Pennsylvania flowed through Chicago on their way west. Lumber from the forests of Michigan and Minnesota came down through Chicago. Cattle and hogs from farms across the Midwest were processed in Chicago's growing meatpacking plants. Money was pouring in. Speculators were buying land. Warehouses and factories and hotels were going up as fast as workers could build them. Fortunes were being made overnight by men who had arrived with nothing. The city was exploding with commerce and ambition and opportunity. Everyone could see the potential. Everyone could smell the money. But nobody had solved the swamp problem. The streets were not paved. They could not be paved. Any stone or plank you laid down simply sank into the mud within weeks. After a heavy rain, the main thoroughfares of Chicago became rivers of brown slurry that could swallow a wagon wheel up to the axle. Horses got stuck so badly that they sometimes had to be shot where they stood because there was no way to pull them out. Pedestrians wore boots that reached to their knees and still came home caked in filth. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal but widely repeated at the time, of a man who saw a hat lying in the middle of a Chicago street. He reached down to pick it up and discovered there was a head underneath it. The head belonged to a man who was stuck in mud up to his neck. When asked if he needed help, the man reportedly said, "No thanks, I'm on horseback." Whether or not that story is true, it captures something real about what Chicago was like in those early years. The mud was legendary. Visitors wrote letters home describing it in tones of disbelief. One traveler said the streets of Chicago were not roads, but bottomless pits of black slime. Another said he had seen mud in many cities, but Chicago mud was a substance unto itself, neither liquid nor solid, but something malevolent in between. A third described watching a fully loaded wagon sink so deep that only the driver's hat was visible. Residents nailed boards together and laid them across the worst sections, creating makeshift bridges over the muck. Some entrepreneurs built wooden sidewalks elevated 2 or 3 feet above the street. But the boards rotted, broke, and sank. Nothing lasted. You could build a perfectly serviceable walkway in the spring and watch it disappear into the earth by autumn. The swamp was patient. The swamp always won. And it was not just inconvenient, it was deadly. The same water that flooded the streets also filled the basements. And because Chicago had no sewer system and no way to drain anything, human waste had nowhere to go. Outhouses overflowed into yards. Chamber pots were dumped into alleys. Slaughterhouses on the south side let blood and offal run directly into the streets because there was no other option. The meatpacking industry was growing rapidly, processing thousands of cattle and hogs every week. The waste from all of that processing had to go somewhere. The bones and guts and blood and fat, the parts that could not be sold, ended up in the streets, in the yards, in the same standing water that everyone waded through every day. Rendering plants boiled down animal carcasses for tallow and oil, and the runoff from those operations added to the miasma. The stench in summer was overwhelming. Visitors described a smell so thick you could taste it. Sweet rot, animal decay, and human waste baking in the heat. The flies were constant, thick black clouds of them hovering over every pile of refuse. The rats were everywhere, fat and bold, barely bothering to run when humans approached. Children played in streets that were essentially open sewers. Women hung laundry to dry in air that reeked of death. And the drinking water came from the same sources that everything else drained into. People drew water from wells that sat just feet away from overflowing privies. They drew water from the Chicago River, which had become an open sewer carrying the waste of 75,000 people toward the lake. They drew water from Lake Michigan, which might have been safe if not for the fact that the same currents that brought in fresh water also circulated the waste that was being dumped near the shore. The intake pipes for the city's water supply sat in water that was visibly contaminated. You could see things floating in it. People drank it anyway because there was no alternative. In 1850, Chicago had its first major cholera outbreak. The disease had come up the Mississippi and across the Great Lakes, carried by steamboat passengers who did not know they were infected, and it found a perfect breeding ground in this city of standing water and open sewage. Cholera does not kill slowly. A healthy person can wake up in the morning feeling fine and be dead by nightfall. The bacteria attacks the intestines, causing massive fluid loss. Victims suffer violent diarrhea and vomiting until they are literally dehydrated to death. Their skin turns blue-gray, a condition doctors called cyanosis. Their eyes sink into their skulls. Their fingers and toes wrinkle and shrivel like they have been soaking in water for hours. Their voices become hoarse whispers as their bodies lose the fluid needed to speak. And at the end, many of them are still fully conscious, aware of what is happening to them, unable to stop it. They can feel themselves dying. They can see their families weeping at the bedside. They can hear the prayers being said over them. And there is nothing anyone can do. It is a terrible way to die. And in 1850, there was no treatment. Doctors did not understand what caused it. They did not know how it spread. They could only watch as their patients shriveled and died, sometimes within hours of showing the first symptoms. The best medical advice of the day was to avoid excitement and to drink brandy. Neither helped. In 1850, over 400 people died in Chicago. The city buried them as fast as it could, sometimes in mass graves because there were not enough coffins. Grave diggers worked around the clock. Churches held services continuously. The wealthy fled to the countryside, packing their families into carriages and heading for relatives in rural areas. The poor had nowhere to go. But that was just the beginning. The city continued to grow. More people came. More buildings went up. More waste accumulated. The conditions that had caused the first outbreak only got worse. The population kept increasing. The swamp kept flooding. The sewage kept piling up. In 1854, cholera returned. This time, it killed 1,424 people in a single summer. That was roughly 6% of the entire population. Think about that number, 6%. Imagine if 6% of your town died between June and September. Imagine every family losing someone. Imagine knowing people who lost multiple children in the same week. Imagine the funerals, one after another, day after day, until the cemeteries could not dig graves fast enough. Imagine the fear that gripped the survivors, the terror of every stomach cramp, every moment of nausea, wondering if this was the beginning of the end. The doctors tried everything they knew. They burned sulfur to purify the air. They administered mercury and opium and brandy. They quarantined the sick, though by then it was usually too late. They told people to avoid fresh fruit, which was believed to cause digestive problems. Nothing worked. The disease moved through the population like a scythe through wheat, cutting down the healthy alongside the weak, taking the young alongside the old. Doctors at the time did not understand germ theory. That would not come for another decade. They believed cholera was caused by miasma, bad air rising from swamps and filth. And in a way, they were not entirely wrong. The bad air came from the same places the contaminated water came from. The correlation was obvious, even if the mechanism was not. Places that smelled the worst had the most deaths. The connection seemed clear, even if the science was backwards. Something had to be done, and by 1855, the city council had finally accepted that there was only one real solution. They could not drain the swamp. The land was too flat, the water table too high. Pumps would not work because there was nowhere for the water to go. Canals would just fill up and become new channels of stagnant waste. Every conventional solution had been tried and had failed, but they could build on top of it. The plan was audacious. Raise the grade of the entire city by 6 to 10 feet. Lay down a proper sewer system at the new level. A system that would actually have slope, that would actually drain toward the river and eventually to the lake. Build new streets on top of the old ones. And somehow, raise every building in downtown Chicago to match. It sounds impossible. It was supposed to be impossible. No one had ever attempted anything like it. No one had ever lifted an entire city into the air. The engineering challenges alone were staggering. The logistics were incomprehensible. The cost would be astronomical. But Chicago had just buried 6% of its population, and the city council was desperate. The man who made it work was an engineer named Ellis Chesbrough. He had been hired in 1855 to design Chicago's first comprehensive sewer system. Chesbrough was from Boston, where he had worked on water and sewage systems that actually functioned. He understood the basic principle that had eluded Chicago's planners. Water flows downhill. If there is no hill, the water does not flow. Chesbrough quickly realized that sewers alone would not solve anything in Chicago. You could build the most beautiful sewer system in the world, but water does not flow uphill. And in Chicago, there was no hill. The land was so flat that sewage would just sit in the pipes with nowhere to go. A conventional sewer system would be nothing more than an underground cesspool, concentrating the waste instead of removing it. His solution was elegant in theory and insane in practice. Build the sewers at street level, where they could actually drain toward the river and the lake. Then, raise the streets themselves by laying down 6 to 14 feet of fill dirt, gravel, and rubble on top of everything that already existed. The new streets would sit above the old streets. The new sewers would sit above the old ground level. And everything would finally have the slope it needed to drain. The first test came in 1856. City workers raised a section of Lake Street by 4 feet, packing dirt and broken brick between the existing buildings and then paving over the top. It worked. The new street drained properly. The sewer beneath it functioned. Water flowed the way water was supposed to flow. But now the buildings along Lake Street sat 4 feet below the new grade. You had to walk down steps to enter them. Their first floors had become basements. Their windows looked out at dirt walls instead of the street. It was better than cholera, but it was far from ideal. The building owners faced a choice: tear down their buildings and rebuild at the new level, which was expensive and slow. Or find a way to raise the buildings themselves. Tearing down and rebuilding was not realistic for most owners. These were not shacks. These were substantial commercial buildings, some of them made of brick and stone, some of them worth small fortunes. Their owners had invested everything in them. They were not eager to demolish their investments and start over from nothing. But raising a building? How do you raise a building? Especially a brick building. Especially a brick building that weighs thousands of tons. It seemed physically impossible. And that is when George Pullman entered the picture. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because what Pullman did next changed the definition of what was possible. Pullman was 27 years old in 1858. He was not a famous engineer. He was not even primarily an engineer. He was a cabinet maker's son from New York who had moved west looking for opportunity. He had some experience moving buildings in upstate New York, where structures occasionally needed to be relocated to make way for the Erie Canal expansion. Small wooden buildings, mostly. Nothing that would prepare anyone for what Chicago required. What Pullman understood was logistics. He understood how to coordinate large teams of workers doing precise, repetitive tasks. He understood that complex operations could be broken down into simple steps, and that if each step was executed correctly and in sequence, the impossible became possible. He had a talent for organization that bordered on genius, and he understood jack screws. A jack screw is a simple device. It is essentially a large bolt housed in a metal frame. When you turn the bolt with a long iron bar, the screw mechanism converts rotational force into vertical lift. One man can raise several tons of weight by simply turning a handle. The mechanical advantage is enormous. The physics are straightforward. The trick is doing it slowly, evenly, and in perfect coordination with dozens or hundreds of other screws lifting the same load. If you have ever used a car jack to change a tire, you understand the basic principle. A small person can lift a 2-ton automobile with a jack because the screw mechanism multiplies their force many times over. Now imagine hundreds of those jacks, arranged in a precise grid, all being turned at exactly the same rate, all lifting exactly the same fraction of an inch with each turn. The force they could generate together was almost unlimited. Pullman's first major contract was the Tremont House, one of Chicago's premier hotels. It was a massive brick building, 4 stories tall, with over 200 rooms. It covered an entire city block. It weighed thousands of tons. It was full of guests who were paying good money and expected to continue receiving service. And Pullman proposed to raise it 6 feet while it was still occupied. The hotel's owners were skeptical. The guests were horrified when they heard the plan. But Pullman was confident, and he offered to forfeit his entire fee if anything went wrong. That guarantee convinced the owners to let him try. The preparation took weeks. Workers dug beneath the foundation in sections, carefully excavating enough space to install the jack screws without collapsing the walls above. They worked in teams, one group digging while another shored up the masonry with wooden cribbing. The cribbing had to be strong enough to support the building temporarily while the screws were positioned beneath it. If the cribbing failed, the whole structure could come down on top of the workers. Every timber had to be placed exactly right. They placed hundreds of screws at precise intervals, each one capable of lifting several tons. The spacing had to be exact. If the screws were too far apart, the weight would not be distributed evenly and the building would crack. If they were too close together, there would not be room for the workers to operate them. Engineers calculated load points and stress lines. Workers checked and double-checked every measurement. A mistake could kill dozens of men. When everything was in place, Pullman assembled his team. Roughly 500 men, each assigned to a single jack screw. They were arranged in rows and columns so that the foreman could see all of them at once. Each man had a long iron bar fitted to his screw. Each man knew his position. Each man waited for the signal. The foreman carried a whistle. When he blew it, every man turned his screw exactly 1/4 turn. Not more, not less. 1/4 turn. About 90 degrees of rotation. The building rose a fraction of an inch. Less than a 1/16 of an inch, probably. Almost imperceptible. The foreman counted to 5. Then he blew the whistle again. Another 1/4 turn. Another fraction of an inch. Then another. Then another. They did this thousands of times over the course of several days. The hotel rose so slowly that the guests inside barely noticed. The dining room served breakfast while the building crept upward. Waiters poured coffee while the floor beneath them lifted toward the sky. Porters carried luggage up staircases that were rising as they climbed them. The front desk checked in new arrivals while the entire structure inched higher with each whistle blast. One newspaper reporter described walking into the lobby on the second day and feeling a strange sensation of slight disorientation. Something was different, but he could not immediately identify what. Then he realized that the building had risen over a foot since his last visit. The street that had been level with the front door was now well below it. He had to step down to exit, where before he had stepped straight out. The guests, remarkably, stayed. They continued eating in the restaurant and sleeping in their rooms while 500 men labored beneath them in the darkness, turning screws a 1/4 turn at a time. Business continued as usual. The only concession to the ongoing work was that the hotel management asked guests to refrain from jumping or running, which might throw off the delicate synchronization of the lifting. Pullman brought the Tremont house up 6 feet without cracking a single window. Not a single pane of glass broke. Not a single wall cracked. Not a single guest was injured. It was a triumph of coordination and engineering. The success was sensational. Newspapers across the country reported it. Other building owners immediately began seeking contractors who could replicate Pullman's achievement. If Pullman could raise the Tremont house, maybe their buildings could be raised too. Maybe this insane plan to lift an entire city could actually work. And what happened next defies everything you think you know about how cities work. Between 1858 and 1870, hundreds of buildings in downtown Chicago were raised. Not just small wooden structures, but massive masonry edifices. Banks, warehouses, hotels, churches, commercial buildings of every description. Some were raised 4 feet. Some were raised 8 feet. Some were raised 14 feet. Each one required the same painstaking process: excavation, cribbing, screw installation, and the slow, synchronized turning that lifted tons of brick and stone into the air. The larger projects required thousands of workers. Pullman himself organized the raising of an entire block at once in 1858, just months after the Tremont House success. He positioned nearly 6,000 jack screws under multiple buildings and hired 600 men to operate them. When the foreman blew his whistle, 600 hands turned 600 screws in perfect unison. The entire block, multiple buildings, an entire city square, rose as a single unit. Contemporary accounts describe the scene as something between a military operation and a factory floor. The men worked in near silence, listening for the whistle. The foreman stood on a raised platform, watching for any sign of uneven lifting or structural stress. Supervisors patrolled the perimeter, checking for cracks or shifting or any sign that something was going wrong. It was precise, coordinated, and utterly unprecedented in the history of construction. The men who did this work were laborers, most of them immigrants. Irish fleeing the famine that had devastated their homeland. Germans seeking economic opportunity. Scandinavians looking for work. They came to Chicago because the city was growing, and growing cities need workers. They found jobs turning jack screws beneath hotels, standing in cramped darkness, breathing brick dust, waiting for a whistle to tell them when to move. We do not know their names. The records do not say who they were. They were paid by the day and went home at night. History remembers Pullman and Chesbrough because they were the organizers, the entrepreneurs, the men with vision and capital. But the work itself was done by thousands of men whose names were never recorded, whose faces were never photographed, whose stories were never told. They lifted a city with their hands, and then they disappeared into the anonymity of the working class. Meanwhile, crews were filling in the streets. Chicago needed millions of cubic yards of fill material. Some of it came from the excavation of the Illinois and Michigan Canal. Some came from demolition sites, the rubble of buildings that had been torn down rather than raised. Some came from dredging the Chicago River, pulling muck from the bottom and piling it on the land. Workers hauled it in by cart and wagon, dumped it between the buildings, and packed it down layer by layer. The transformation was so gradual that residents barely noticed it happening. One season, the street was at one level. The next season, it was a foot higher. Buildings that had once sat flush with the ground now had exposed basements. Then, those basements were buried under fill. New sidewalks appeared at the new level. New storefronts emerged on what had been second floors. It must have felt like living in a dream where the ground itself was unreliable, where you could not trust the earth to stay where you left it. But not everyone participated. Hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. Stories of the workers who built America before power tools existed. Some building owners refused to raise their structures. The cost was substantial, sometimes as much as the building itself was worth. Landlords who rented to lower-income tenants saw no financial incentive to invest in raising. Their tenants could not pay higher rents, so why spend the money? Others simply did not believe the whole project would succeed and wanted to wait and see how it turned out. Still others were stubborn, or cheap, or philosophically opposed to the whole idea of government-coordinated construction projects. The city could not force them. Property rights were sacrosanct. If a man owned a building and did not want to raise it, that was his prerogative under the law. The streets around him would go up, but his building would stay where it was. The result was chaos. By 1865, downtown Chicago existed at two different levels simultaneously. Some streets had been raised 6 or 8 feet. Other streets, sometimes just one block over, remained at the original grade. The buildings that had been raised towered over the buildings that had not. Neighbors who had once looked each other in the eye now looked at each other's rooftops. Walking through the city required constant adjustment. You might step out of a raised building onto a raised sidewalk, walk half a block, then descend a temporary wooden staircase to reach a street that sat 6 feet lower. Cross that street, climb another staircase, and you were back at the new grade. Turn a corner, and find yourself on a ramp that descended gradually from the new level to the old. Turn another corner, and find a bridge connecting two raised buildings over a lowered street that ran between them. The visual effect was bizarre, like an Escher drawing come to life. Buildings that had once been neighbors now existed on different planes. You could look out a second-floor window and see directly into your neighbor's 4th floor. Front doors opened onto staircases that went down in some cases and up in others. Street addresses became meaningless because the same address might exist at 2 different elevations depending on whether the building had been raised. Some businesses that refused to raise found themselves literally underground. Their front doors, once at street level, now opened into dirt walls where the raised street had been built right up to their facades. Enterprising owners cut new entrances into what had been their second floors, turning their first floors into basements and their basements into sub-basements, accessible only by internal stairs. Others dug out the fill in front of their buildings, creating sunken courtyards accessible by stairs from the new street above, like the entrance to a subway station before subways existed. Bridges connected raised sidewalks to lowered buildings. Ramps zigzagged between levels. Wooden staircases sprouted everywhere, some permanent and some temporary, some well-built and some barely functional. The city was a three-dimensional maze that visitors found incomprehensible, and the danger was constant. Many buildings sat on temporary wooden cribbing while their owners saved money for permanent masonry foundations. This cribbing was essentially stacked timber, strong enough to hold up a building, but highly flammable. The elevated wooden sidewalks were also fire hazards, made of the same cheap lumber that was used for everything else. The entire downtown was a maze of exposed lumber, just waiting for a spark. Some buildings cracked during the raising process. Masonry that seemed solid before lifting revealed hidden weaknesses when subjected to the uneven forces of thousands of jack screws. A wall that had stood for years might suddenly develop a fissure when the foundation beneath it shifted even slightly. A few buildings collapsed entirely during the raising process, bringing down tons of brick on the workers below. Others settled unevenly after being raised, leaving them tilted at alarming angles that made doors stick and windows crack. There were injuries. There were almost certainly deaths, though records are spotty and incomplete. The men operating the jack screws worked in cramped, dangerous conditions beneath thousands of tons of brick and stone. A single mistake, a screw that slipped, a timber that gave way, a load that shifted unexpectedly, and they would be crushed before they could cry out. The work was done by hand, in the dark, with no safety equipment beyond a man's own judgment and the hope that everyone else was doing their job correctly. It is impossible that everyone survived. The names of those who died were never recorded. And the city kept growing through all of it. New buildings went up on the raised grade, while old buildings were still being lifted to meet them. Construction never stopped, not for a day. The noise of hammers and saws and shouting crews was constant from dawn to dusk. Chicago was building and raising and filling simultaneously. A city under perpetual reconstruction. A metropolis that was literally reshaping itself while people lived and worked in it. This went on for over a decade. By 1871, Chicago had mostly completed its transformation. The downtown business district sat 8 to 14 feet higher than it had in 1850. The new sewer system was functioning properly. The streets drained as they were supposed to drain. Cholera outbreaks had declined dramatically because the drinking water was no longer contaminated with sewage. The city that had once been a swamp was now a modern metropolis with working infrastructure that was the envy of cities across America. George Pullman had become wealthy and famous from his building-raising contracts. He used the money he made to launch a new venture, the Pullman Palace Car Company, which would revolutionize train travel by building luxury sleeping cars for America's growing railroad network. The same man who lifted hotels would go on to build an entire company town for his workers, a utopian community called Pullman on the south side of Chicago that would eventually become the site of one of the most famous labor strikes in American history. But that is another story. The raising of Chicago should have been the end of the struggle. The city had conquered its swamp. It had built a modern infrastructure on top of a landscape that should have made civilization impossible. The future seemed limitless. Chicago was poised to become one of the great cities of the world, a center of commerce and industry rivaling New York and Philadelphia. And then, on the night of October 8, 1871, a fire started on the southwest side. The exact cause is still debated by historians. Legend blames Mrs. O'Leary's cow knocking over a lantern in a barn, but that story was likely invented by a newspaper reporter looking for a colorful detail to spice up his copy. What is certain is that the fire began in a working-class neighborhood full of wooden shanties and spread with terrifying speed. It had been a dry summer, one of the driest on record. The wooden sidewalks, the wooden cribbing beneath the raised buildings, the wooden buildings themselves, all of it was tinder dry and waiting for a spark. The wind was blowing hard from the southwest, pushing the flames directly toward downtown. Embers flew through the air, landing on rooftops blocks away and starting new fires before anyone could respond to the first one. Fire companies responded, but they were sent to the wrong location initially. A watchman in a tower spotted the flames but misjudged their location by several blocks. By the time the fire crews reached the actual fire, it was already out of control and spreading faster than men could run. They fought it as best they could with the equipment they had, but the flames moved faster than they could contain them. The fire jumped the Chicago River. It should not have been possible. The river was supposed to be a natural fire break, a barrier of water that flames could not cross. But the bridges over the river were made of wood, and the buildings along the riverbank were made of wood, and burning debris floated downstream on the current and ignited new fires on the other side. The river itself seemed to be on fire, the surface burning with oil and grease and floating wreckage. The flames consumed block after block of the downtown that had been so painstakingly raised over the previous 15 years. The Tremont house, the hotel that Pullman had lifted so carefully in 1858, burned to the ground. Banks and warehouses and churches and hotels, all of them gone in a matter of hours. The wooden cribbing beneath many buildings caught fire and burned, collapsing the structures above into flaming pits. Everything they had built was being destroyed. The fire burned for 2 days. When it finally died out on October 10th, over 3 square miles of the city had been destroyed. Nearly 18,000 buildings were gone. Almost 300 people were dead, though the actual toll was likely higher because so many bodies were never recovered from the rubble and ash. Over 100,000 people, roughly 1/3 of the entire population, were homeless. Much of what they had raised was reduced to ash. But here is the thing. The grade itself survived. The streets remained at their new elevation. The fill dirt and rubble and packed earth did not burn. The sewer system, built of brick and stone beneath the fill, continued to function exactly as Chesbrough had designed it. The foundation upon which Chicago had rebuilt itself was still there, scorched and blackened, but intact. And so they rebuilt again. The Chicago that rose from the ashes of 1871 was built on the same raised grade that Pullman and Chesbrough and thousands of unnamed workers had created. The skyscrapers that would make Chicago famous in the 20th century, the first steel frame high-rises, the architectural innovations that would change construction around the world, all of them stand on fill dirt that was poured over a swamp in the 1860s. Every building in the Loop today rests on the work of those forgotten laborers. Subscribe for more Forgotten American History, because the story does not end with the rebuilding. The original Chicago is still down there. If you know where to look, you can find traces of it. Basement levels that were once ground floors. Old storefronts buried beneath modern sidewalks. The foundations of buildings that were never raised, still sitting at the original grade, with 10 or 12 feet of city built on top of them. When construction crews dig deep for new foundations, they sometimes break through into the old city, into spaces that have not seen light since before the Civil War. Archaeological excavations have uncovered bits of the original street surface, the wooden planks that sank into the mud 170 years ago. They have found artifacts from the pre-raising era, buried where they fell when the fill was poured in around them. Bottles and broken dishes and coins and tools, all of them sitting in a time capsule beneath the modern city, preserved by accident when someone decided the best way to deal with a swamp was to bury it. In 2015, workers digging a new subway line discovered a section of original wooden sidewalk about 12 feet below the current street. It was remarkably preserved, the boards still intact, still bearing the marks of the saws that cut them more than 150 years ago. If you looked closely, you could almost see the footprints of people who walked on them before the Civil War. Every foundation in downtown Chicago sits on top of a city that was once at street level. They did not tear it down. They did not abandon it and start fresh somewhere else. They picked it up. 5,000 men turning 5,000 jack screws. A foreman's whistle. A quarter turn at a time. Day after day, week after week, until an entire city rose into the air. That is how you raise a city. The men who did this work are almost entirely forgotten. We do not know their names. We do not know where they came from, or what happened to them after the work was done. They were laborers, immigrants, day workers who showed up for a wage and went home at night, covered in dirt and sweat and brick dust. They did not write memoirs. They did not give interviews to historians. They did not leave behind records of what it felt like to stand beneath a hotel in the darkness, turning a screw, knowing that if anything went wrong, they would be crushed by thousands of tons of brick. But every person who walks down Michigan Avenue today walks on their work. Every building in the Loop stands on foundations that exist because those men lifted what was there before. Every toilet that flushes into a sewer that actually drains does so because someone had the insane courage to say, "We cannot drain this swamp, so we will build on top of it." They raised an entire city by hand. That is not mythology. That is not legend. That is history, documented and verified. One of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the 19th century. And it happened because a swamp killed 6% of the population, and someone decided that was not acceptable. Someone decided the laws of nature could be overruled by human stubbornness and engineering and the willingness to try something that had never been attempted before. The experts of the day said it could not be done. The skeptics said it was a waste of money. The practical men said it was foolish to try. And then 5,000 men with iron bars proved them all wrong, one quarter turn at a time. The next time you flush a toilet and the water actually goes somewhere, think about Chicago. Think about 5,000 men with iron bars and jack screws, standing in the dark beneath a hotel, waiting for the whistle. Think about what it took to build the world you live in. And subscribe if you want more stories of the people who did the impossible before anyone told them it could not be done. Because there are thousands of these stories. We have barely scratched the surface. The original Chicago is still down there, buried under 170 years of progress. And the only reason it is buried, the only reason anything stands above it at all, is because somebody decided to pick it up and start over. That is the story of Chicago. That is the story of America. And it started with a swamp, a plague, and the madness to believe that even the ground beneath your feet can be changed if you refuse to accept it the way it is.